Hello, and welcome to another episode of Kings of History, a podcast where we'll be talking about all the kings of Portugal chronologically. In the last episode, we learned that from an early age, the future King Sancho I shared many of the royal duties with his father. We also learned that the relations between the Portuguese and Leonese kingdoms weren't the best, and tensions were growing near the border of Ribacoa. In today's episode, we will continue our journey through the early years of the life of King Sancho I, the second king of Portugal. But before we start, I'd like to remind everyone that you can listen to all the episodes released so far via our website, kingsofhistory.buzzsprout.com. You can also follow us on social media so that you're always up to date when we release new episodes and many other things. So stop by and give us a like. If you are feeling generous and would like to contribute to the insurmountable amount of coffee that we need to keep our episodes fresh, stop by our Patreon. Now, let's get down to business, shall we? As we talked about in the previous episode, Gerald the Fearless's campaign had almost only one objective: to conquer Badajoz. Now that was a city worth taking, holding, and integrating. This was because it was the most populous and important city in those parts, and although Mérida had once been the ecclesiastical capital of the dioceses of Lusitania, if we remember correctly from episode 2, Santiago de Compostela took over those rights, depleting the importance of the city, which was now practically depopulated. So yes, the big city in Extremadura was Badajoz, which had even been the capital of an important Taifa kingdom at the time of Ferdinand the Great and Alfonso VI, a Taifa that rivaled the size and importance of Toledo and Seville. The failure of King Afonso Henriques to take that city was devastating, and partially explains the Portuguese offensive on it, which up to that point had been impressive and had reached as far as the vicinities of Mérida itself, with important squares such as Trujillo and Cáceres taken, quickly fizzled out, as if it no longer made sense without Badajoz. But you might be asking, what about the territories further south? Why was Portugal, which had shown such ability to control almost the whole of the Alentejo region, conquering Beja several times, unable to hold on to its conquests? To answer this, we can resort to a somewhat simplistic saying: conquering is easy, but maintaining it is a whole other story. Portugal proved that any long-term conquests were achieved inch by inch, square by square, city by city, without the concern or without the ability to establish another defensive line capable of rivaling the one that was being set up on the Tagus River. And you ask, what defensive line could they take? And that is a very good question, but we'll get to that. For now, we appeal to your memory and geographical knowledge. All of those who have or used to have traveled to the Algarve, a routine part of their summers, whether via the A2 or the more inland roads, will understand when we say that the conditions of the terrain in the Alentejo region are not very suitable for defense, especially against a military force that relied so heavily on light cavalry and rapid maneuvers, as is traditionally the case with the Arabs. The same cavalry that, in the mountainous north, had such a hard time defeating the Christians in the early stages of the Reconquista, but here in the Alentejo region would be unstoppable in the battlefield. For this reason, there was only one possible form of defense: fortify every hilltop with a castle, and indeed, at the risk of exaggerating a little bit, even today we can see that this is what the Alentejo is like, with villages usually placed on top of hills, each of which has or had a castle in the past. But that wouldn't have been enough, as the surrounding open terrain would have prevented an effective defense of those castles against an army that couldn't be beaten in open terrain. And in fact, if we look at historians' estimates, they say that at that time Portugal would have been able to routinely muster only around 5,000 men-at-arms, and that would have been a lot. but the Arabs, when united and properly led, often managed armies of 20,000, 30,000, or even more. We realized early on that these enemy armies were in fact unstoppable in the open. The only way to stop them would be to build lines of fortifications capable of helping each other. But that territory was sparsely populated, and in order to promote its occupation, it would take an effort of many years, during which the new settlements and communities would have to be protected from any attack, looting, or depredation by the enemy, or it would drive the population away and we would be back to square one. Portugal simply didn't have the capacity, the population, or the military power to advance or garrison the only two lines of defense that could guarantee any form of protection for that newly conquered Alentejo. One would be to fortify the Guadiana River from Elvas to the estuary, as was being done with the Tagus, and the other, perhaps more important, to advance to the foot of the Algarve Mountains and build a line there. We appeal to your memory once again. On the journey to the Algarve via Alentejo, you'll notice that close to the border between these two provinces the terrain suddenly changes and is no longer reminiscent of the plains that were left behind. The Algarve Mountains run from west to east, from the sea to the Guadiana River, forming a formidable barrier of rugged terrain that partially explains why, legally speaking, the Algarve was always a kingdom within the Crown of Portugal until 1910, and why, until the creation of effective roads in modern times, traveling there was much easier and cheaper by sea than by land. These are the geologistical reasons. At the beginning of the summer of 1169, with King Afonso Henriques in captivity in Leon for a month now, and a young 14-year-old Sancho as the possible heir to the throne, the situation in Portugal was terrible. It wasn't known whether there would be an early coronation, whether the kingdom would lose its independence as a result of the King of Leon's pressure on the Portuguese monarch, or at what would be the price of Afonso Henriques' release. The answer would soon come. The chronicles on the other side of the border, which glorify the Badajoz campaign as a huge victory and a remarkable feat of arms, also hastened to paint Ferdinand II in the mold of a magnanimous king who didn't want anything more than what was rightfully his, or what he was entitled to ask for. I'm sure you remember when, in the contextualization episodes, we talked about colorful versions of events written by our brothers from the other side of the border. We told you to wait a bit longer. Well, it's time to reveal those truths apparently held back in those documents. According to the first chronicles, written from the beginning of the 13th century in Leon, Castile, and then after the two kingdoms reunited, Afonso Henriques gave his son-in-law all the territory that was his, that is, the entire Kingdom of Portugal and its recent conquests. But Ferdinand II, as magnanimous as he was brave, refused the offer as it was too heavy for his father-in-law, agreeing only to Portugal withdrawing from the territory around Badajoz and the left bank of the Guadiana River, and returning the lands of Limia and Toronho in Galicia to Leon. Once freed, Afonso Henriques was never able to ride again because of his injuries, and became a diminished king in the face of the greatness of the Leonese king. Later, during the reign of Alfonso X the Wise, the Castilian chronicles added another detail, that our King Afonso Henriques had sworn that if he was ever to ride again, he would become his son-in-law's vassal, but he never did. And the very Portuguese General Chronicle of Spain, written by Prince Pedro Afonso in 1344, also adds that, based on records from the Annals of Santa Cruz, which were more or less contemporary with the events described, that Afonso Henriques only never rode again so as not to have to submit to vassalage to the Leonese. In other words, if the Portuguese sources also confirm the oath made to Ferdinand II, and add the detail that the king was even able to ride a horse after all, then it surely must be true that King Afonso Henriques wasn't that badly injured in Badajoz, and it was all just a trick, right? Not necessarily, and don't call me Shirley. Probably, in the eyes of a monk from Coimbra, who did everything to dignify his king's image as a champion of the faith, a valiant warrior, a great leader in the fight against the infidels, and almost invincible, admitting that he spent the last 16 years of his life as an invalid would seem more damaging to his future image than the clever king who simply faked a serious injury in order to escape humiliation and thus safeguard the future of his kingdom. In other words, our conclusion, which is in line with most of the opinions of Portuguese and Spanish historians, is that King Afonso Henriques must almost certainly have been physically affected forever. Later, when the king returned, accompanied by his daughter Urraca, who must have come to Portugal briefly also to get rid of the pressures and hostile environment she had experienced during her marriage to Ferdinand II, a real revolution took place in court. Some officials who had remained in those positions for years were simply replaced by others, and one of the main changes was the elevation of Fernando Afonso, the first illegitimate son of King Afonso Henriques, to the position of High Standard Bearer of the Kingdom. A brief introduction to the positions at court, known at the time as the King's Court. Throughout the Middle Ages, there were some changes to these posts, with the inclusion of members such as a Portuguese equivalent of the Minister of Finance today, but the three most important at that early stage were the officers who governed the three main divisions that existed in the administration: the Chamber, the Arms, and the Chancellery. In the Chamber, a word that derives from the synonym for the King's Chambers, the Chief Steward was in charge, responsible for the King's affairs, his palace, and others, including, in the first two reigns, some administrative matters. In the Arms, the High Standard Bearer was in charge, who, in these early years, was, after the king, the second commander-in-chief of the armies and who commanded in the monarch's absence. Lastly, with the introduction of a royal chancellery, for the time being it was the monks of the monastery of the Holy Cross of Coimbra who fulfilled this need, the chancellor became the king's prime minister. But for the time being, this main function was to guard the royal seal, authenticate documents, and generally deal with the state documentation. We've left here a very succinct and simplistic explanation of what these positions really were, and there are many more developments. So, Fernando Afonso was now the commander of the armies, a role that was still seen in the collective mind of the kingdom as the most important that a king should fulfill. Moreover, his father could never lead the armies again, which gave this position even greater importance. Sancho must have been quite concerned regarding this promotion. It's true that he was the king's son and legitimate successor, but we've already seen how much that was worth in practice in the middle of the 12th century. But King Afonso Henriques conjured another massive administrative endeavor. Not only did he associate his son with the governance of the kingdom and the confirmation of documents and dispatches, but he also gave him a completely independent body of officials, such as a steward, a standard bearer, a chancellor, and others. And he placed their names side by side with the names of his own positions in the king's court. In other words, from that moment on, the end of 1169 until 1173, the documents would include the officials of King Afonso Henriques, who would also be those of the court or of the kingdom, and those of Sancho, who would be named in the documents as King Sancho. A lot of ink has been spilled on the meaning of this gesture, and which of the two groups of officials would have more weight in political decisions, but we won't go into that too much. Nor the fact that Sancho was labeled king in the documentation as important as our modern view might make it seem, since it was customary in the 12th century Hispania for the son of a king to be king when he ruled. After all, Teresa, being the daughter of Alfonso VI, also used the title of queen, even though she was ruling a county. On the 15th of August 1170, King Afonso Henriques knighted his son. This is another Hispanic tradition which, if you analyze it carefully, isn't as important as one might think. Those in favor of a Sancho diminished before his father say that this gesture is yet another example of that submission. After all, Afonso Henriques knighted himself in Zamora, and, on the other side of the border, in Leon, Alfonso VIII of Castile did the same on the 11th of November 1169, which was also his birthday. So, what did this really mean? Was Sancho any less than his father and Alfonso VIII who knighted themselves? Not really, since they were both fatherless, which means that their predecessor couldn't knight them, passing on a certain royal dignity to them. Speaking of Alfonso VIII, the fact that he was knighted when he was barely old enough, because he had to be 14, and shortly after the tragedy of Badajoz, may have had some significance. It's as if he was sending a message to his uncle that, however much he had managed to defeat and imprison the King of Portugal and forced them to accept concessions, he shouldn't try to do the same with Castile. And the truth is that Ferdinand II of Leon, in those early days following his father-in-law's release, doesn't seem to have been all that reassured by what the Castilian chronicles would call a resounding victory and great magnanimous power. In a matter of months, he was once again dispatching donations and fortifying the lands along the border with Portugal, from the new Ciudad Rodrigo to Galicia, with Tui and the territory of Limia being the prime beneficiaries. Clearly, Ferdinand II was afraid of reprisals and was looking for a way to prevent them. We now return to Sancho, knighted more than a year after the tragedy of Badajoz, with apparently nothing to justify his promotion. Nothing? Well, sort of. You might ask, why not be knighted during the 2 months that his father, King Afonso Henriques, was captive in Leon, when the uncertainty about what would happen to the kingdom or the crown was overwhelming? There's a lot that we don't know about this dark period in Portuguese history, and apparently a triumphant period for the Leonese. For example, the fact that the latter demanded so much when they had the Portuguese king in their custody, and bearing in mind that just 11 years earlier they had signed an agreement with Castile, which, among other things, stipulated the total extinction of Portugal as an independent entity. If there's one thing that common sense tells us, is that in a negotiation we go as far as we can go, and eventually both parties find a balance in each other's strengths and weaknesses. In other words, Portugal probably wasn't so weak in the eyes of the Leonese that they could demand more than what they actually got, which in this case was the ceding of Toronho and Limia to Ferdinand II and the return of the conquered territories beyond the Guadiana River to the Almohads. And the knighthood of Sancho had a much more important facet than Portuguese historiography has forgotten: a new attempt to conquer Badajoz. While in Portugal, the king, the prince, and the court were licking their wounds, Gerald the Fearless continued his campaigns as if what had happened in that May of '69 was just a setback. Even though he retired to his headquarters in Jurumanha, he continued to be a massive pain in the back for the Almohads. In March of 1170, he once again threatened the outskirts of Badajoz, plundering a caravan of supplies and materials that the Almohad Caliph had managed to dispatch from Seville to help recover the city. It was probably in anticipation of a new opportunity to attack the Extremadura region that King Afonso Henriques, now unable to act as military commander, armed his son as a knight. And Sancho may have been involved in the failed attempt to retake Badajoz in that November. That same month, Ferdinand II renewed the military assistance agreement with the governor of the city and the Almohad Caliph. And with the retreat of the Portuguese forces, the Almohads managed to expel Gerald from Jurumanha. But he just wouldn't let it go like that, and without ceasing to be a thorn in the side for the Muslims, in August of 1172, he conquered Beja once again, only for the Portuguese to have to abandon it in January of 1173. Soon enough, as we have seen in episode 4 of King Afonso Henriques, Gerald himself would pay for his audacity. In fact, it seemed that the happy years of conquest by the Christians were coming to an end. In 1172, the Almohad Caliph, Yusuf I, came to Al-Andalus, setting in Seville. That same year, the Wolf King, Ibn Mardanish, died, and his son surrendered to the invaders, who now only had to worry about the infidels to the north. That same summer, they plundered the area of the Castilian Tagus River between Talavera and Toledo, and attempted to conquer Huete, which was about 100 kilometers to the east of Toledo. The Caliph himself commanded the troops. At the beginning of 1172, Rome sent Cardinal Jacinto as a plenipotentiary legate, a diplomat with full powers, to settle various pending issues, promote peace between the Iberian kingdoms, and settle two main matters: the long-standing question of the primacy of Spain, disputed between Toledo and Braga, and the marriage of Ferdinand II to the Portuguese Lady Urraca. He was in Portugal between January and February of 1173. In July 1173, Alfonso VIII, who had lost his ally, the Wolf King, and had received the brunt of the Almohad's hostility the previous year, signed a 5-year truce with them. Afonso Henriques, foreseeing the danger of an Almohad empire allied with Leon, and now at peace with Castile, and fearing that Portugal would become a target, sent ambassadors to Seville in that same July of 1173. In September, they reached an agreement that was in every way similar to the one the Castilian king had signed. This speaks volumes of the power and prestige that Portugal still enjoyed in the eyes of its enemies and neighbors, despite the setbacks of recent years. If Portugal didn't suffer, Leon did, as he saw Yusuf attack that same year in September. It seemed that the alliance was over, something that Cardinal Jacinto's visit helped, since it was also his aim that the Christian kingdoms should fight Islam on a united front rather than wasting their energy fighting each other. And with this alliance broken between Leon and the Almohads, the latter laid siege to the city of Rodrigo, which narrowly avoided falling into Muslim hands. This siege took place between October 1174 and the beginning of 1175. And that's it for this second episode of King Sancho I, where we realize why Portugal was unable to maintain its conquests south of the Tagus River. We've also seen our neighbor's chronicles from the time Afonso Henriques was held captive by his neighboring king, Ferdinand II of Leon, and we end with Sancho I being knighted. In the next episode, we'll continue our journey through the life of King Sancho I. Take care, kings and queens.